Have you been to jail for justice? I wanna shake your hand. 'Cause singing and lying down are ways to take a stand. Have you sung a song for freedom or marched that picket line? Have you been to jail for justice? Then you're a friend of mine.
Welcome to another edition of Talking Together. I'm Richard Sentner, and back with me is my team, Ed Mangiafico and John Amir. Thank you both for being here. Okay, the subject that we're going to be tackling today is religion in the U.S. political economy. And among other things, we're going to focus on this book called One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America by Kevin M. Kruse. And then we'll be discussing other aspects of the intersection between religion and our politics. So, John, you want to start us off?
Thank you, Dick. Yes, Kruse, it's a very powerful book. We mentioned it in our last show. And what he's done in his research is demonstrate how, as the New Deal progressed and corporate America was looking for a way to counter the New Deal, they came upon the idea that they could use religion to counter the New Deal. And they got a number of preachers, including this guy, James Fifield, who's a Congregationalist minister in LA, to argue that the what they call the socialistic aspect of the New Deal was contrary to the New Testament. Right. Now, we can talk about this later, but their definition of New Testament eludes me. That's
sure.
And
for sure.
Throughout, from that time, and he's talking about 1930s, the National Association of Manufacturers first met and started inviting these preachers to talk. From that time to the present, religion has been used by corporate America as a control device.
And spiritual mobilization, wasn't that the phrase that they used?
That was
the first organization.
Yeah.
The number of organizations that have popped up.
That's right.
And what they pop up in terms of denying climate change, denying anything that the corporate America feels is detrimental to their profits and their well-being. And so religion comes in. Capitalism, religion is synonymous with capitalism, capitalism synonymous with religion. And to contradict that is to be irreligious.
And they created the term religious nationalism as a way of combining the two things.
Okay, so go ahead.
I'll start by saying that Goebbels and Bernays would really be proud of the role religion can play. I think that there's no question. We've talked in previous shows about the means by which the corporate agenda manages the public mind. And I think we've talked about the use of fear as an example. But this book truly illustrates how powerful the use of religion is. And of course, religion has been a means of controlling people throughout history. But really, in this context, since the late 1930s, when, as John says, overcoming the New Deal, corporate America was not popular in the 30s during the Depression, of course. And they wanted to overcome that. And they finally closed in on the idea that they could get religious zealots, evangelists, and certain ministers, and heads of many denominations to support it. I think what amazes me is the number of people who are names that we all recognize, from Bob Hope, Walt Disney, on and on and on, are people who supported the idea of religion, and it manifests. The book allows us to manifest it in the creation of adding one nation under God to the pledge, as well as the first official motto which had got stamped on our currency.
Well, in God we trust.
In God we trust. I'm saying
Right.
for that, and one nation under God in the pledge.
Right.
And those are sort of illustrations of how we inculcated the religion into the minds of everybody, and incidentally created a lot of controversy and coalesced a lot of strong feeling. And that's not just at the Depression. It continued through and right after the war. It's continued through Eisenhower.
Well, he takes it all the way through Obama, actually.
And all the way through Obama.
Yeah.
Well, he makes, he really, he traces the corporate leaders from 1930s on. But as you say, with the election of Eisenhower went whole hog into this.
That's right.
I don't know whether he had
Well, this is what I wanted to talk about, was that
something.
if we go back to the beginning of the book, he actually sets up this mythology and then he proceeds to break it down. And the mythology is that it was under Ike's administration that suddenly things really sort of took off, and what the book goes on to argue is that that's when it sort of hit its fruition, but it actually began in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
There was this myth that we've always been like a Christian nation from the very beginning, and one thing he does is he gives statistics on church attendance, which was incredibly low until the late 30s.
And incidentally, that's what I mean by by being able to manipulate the public mind. That's why I said Goebbels and Bernays would be very proud.
Sure.
The truth of the matter is, we went from a low in the 30% category to 80% at its high of people who said they were.
And it had been lower than
that
in decades before that. The one thing, I think we needed to dismiss with is this idea that somehow the founding fathers were building this sort of Christian nation, because nothing could be further from the truth.
And that's what
we are going to spend some time on that, because
that's right.
that has been completely falsified.
That's right.
But just one slight contradiction, Dick. It did take off under the Eisenhower administration. Yeah. It was built before, as you say.
Right.
It was built before. For example, in 1953, right, first year that Ike was in office, we had the first ever national prayer breakfast.
That's right.
And the theme was government under God.
Yeah.
And the year after that, 1954, we added the pledge under God.
Yeah.
Now, this will probably drive right-wing people nuts, but the guy who first wrote the pledge was a minister, a Baptist minister, and a socialist.
Right.
And he didn't include under God.
Right, that's right.
That came with it.
That's right.
So, yeah, we have this. There's a sentence from Kruse's book. Fifield, the minister, and like-minded ministers saw Christianity and capitalism as inextricably intertwined, and argued that spreading the gospel of one required spreading the gospel of the other. So the corporate leaders, the National Association of Manufacturers, the others, had exactly what they wanted.
Right.
I want to tie two elements of the title of this program together, because the reality is that, and you quote but also you see that these evangelists, these preachers, these heads of churches saw an opportunity to serve their own purpose by combining the religious message with free enterprise, individualism, and capitalism.
Well, the individualism thing I think is kind of interesting, because they were trying to contrast it with the New Deal approach,
Right.
Which was the social gospel,
Right, right.
as a community of people, and what these right-wing ministers and their industrials who were supporting them were doing was trying to narrow it down to the individual, to get away from the idea of the community.
I think, in fairness, too, before we leave Eisenhower, I was impressed with the fact that while I think Eisenhower may have been the one who was genuinely religious himself, or became so.
Yeah, Kruse makes that point. Yeah.
And I think that it's also clear that he, on the other hand, while he did believe in Republican position. The truth of the matter is that he was not anti-government, and he did many things to create an expansion of government in a positive way.
Of the New Deal programs themselves.
That's right. And so it wasn't really until after Eisenhower, although that's where the prayer breakfast started and the religion. I think the most glaring guy that comes out in this thing is Richard Nixon, who clearly was the absolute hypocrite who took advantage of knowing that he could get hold of the moral majority and as a voting thing, and created the Sunday church service in the White House, and used it as a political mechanism.
I thought it was interesting that it turns out that in the 1960 presidential election between Nixon and Kennedy, that Life magazine was scheduled to publish this endorsement of Billy Graham endorsing Nixon, and Henry Luce, who was the editor, said no way, it's not going to happen, and they decided that they didn't want to make that mistake again 8 years later in '68 when Nixon was running again. And so Billy Graham very sort of publicly endorsed Nixon.
Right.
And they were sort of joined at the hip ever since.
Well, and he would have Nixon speak at his big affairs that he had.
What is glaring to me, use the word glaring, what is glaring to me is that the New Testament is entirely collectivist. In fact, if you want to use modern terminology, you could say Jesus was maybe the first socialist.
Yeah.
Everything about the New Testament,
at least a communitarian,
is communitarian. It is collectivist.
They don't have too many good things to say about the rich in the New Testament either.
It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, which is in Mark. But what is remarkable is how you can take this highly communitarian, collectivist theology and turn it exactly opposite. There's a wonderful book we've talked about on the show before. It's by, interestingly, a Muslim, Reza Aslan.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And it came out in 2013. It's called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
And of course, the right wing goes ballistic about this.
Well, when he appeared on Fox News, did you see the clip of him when he was on Fox News?
Lorna Green asked him.
He really took this woman to task.
Well,
who tried to
she asked him, how can a Muslim write about Christianity?
Yeah.
But what Aslan, the point that Aslan really brings up is related to our topic, that Jesus was in essence an ethical philosopher, a philosopher of ethics.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's all the New Testament is about. And yet what Kruse is pointing out is that they took this New Testament and made it completely the opposite of what
well, and for their own purpose, and because by combining their effort, the religious effort, with the political agenda of the national, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Manufacturing Association, they were able to get more people to attend their churches at the same time. And so they just contrived the message to suit that message, and it worked perfectly. And incidentally, it's still working. And we wonder when we say, and I think this is maybe a good time to insert this. As I read the book, I kept thinking about news programs we see today. You know, we're dealing with the issues of abortion because of something in the Bible, presumably. We're dealing with issues of
gay marriage
because it's in the Bible, albeit Leviticus. But anyway, and it's to me, what's the whole issue of those kinds of issues is still an outgrowth of having created this enormous moral majority attitude and the politicians capitalizing on it. I would also say, and this is a little maybe not popular with even my liberal colleagues, but you see, I happen to believe that what we call the counterculture or the hippie movement actually fed into awakening the right-wing extremists.
In what way?
Well, because they were afraid of it. They were afraid of it because it represented, you know, it was against the rigidity of law and order.
I wouldn't just say the counterculture, but the whole, everything that was going on in the 60s, the protests
right.
against the Vietnam War, and
all of that.
I'd be surprised if you ran into people who oppose that. That is virtually historical fact, that the right wing thrived as a reaction to the 60s. Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
But and incidentally, you see the. But I think they identified with the, you know, even Kruse points out during that big 4th of July Praise America that was set up. Right. You know, he refers to those people that were all smoking marijuana.
Yeah, that's
maybe they all were, maybe they all weren't. But
as Kruse points out, nowhere, to get back to your original point there, nowhere in the New Testament does Jesus talk about gays, about gay marriage,
or abortion.
About abortion. None of that. That's all been inserted. But it gets even deeper. There's a review of the book by Alan Bean, who is a religious writer. And he writes, time and again, Fifield, this leader of this movement, this minister, condemned a variety of what he calls socialistic laws, such as minimum wage, price control, Social Security pensions for the elderly, unemployment insurance, veterans benefits, as well as a wide range of federal taxation that he deemed tyrannical in nature. What better device could the corporate world have than to have these ministers in front so they can sit in the back making these kinds of statements? When I read the book, I had to remind again myself what I concluded at one point, that Fifield and Billy Graham and Mike Huckabee and these other ministers make Elmer Gantry look like a saint.
That's right. That's right.
That's how distorted.
I thought of Elmer Gantry myself when I
now, and we shouldn't overlook one other thing that Kruse points out that I think is very important. In the period of the 50s, we're talking about things that, like the 60s movement, that sort of awakened the conservative reaction, and it manifests itself in the religious fervor. Well, that I think they were able to combine the idea of communism with religion.
Oh, yeah.
It was either Christ or communism.
That almost became a religion, really, anti-communism.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, you can take the almost out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so that promoted the idea of religious fervor during that time. That's when people resented anything that took away from the idea of our devotion to God.
One other thing reading this book that just got to me very much was that how we've gone from the period 1927 or 25, whenever it was, 25, the Scopes trial, when this religious fundamentalism was thoroughly discredited, to where we are now, where, as he points out, you have anti-science movements, you have anti-environmental movements, which satisfy the corporations beautifully. But there's an element of ignorance. He doesn't use that word, but there's an element of ignorance. You know, for example, he does point out this literal interpretation of the
Bible.
Of the Bible, and I've got to do this. This is something Clarence Darrow pointed out, but if you take a literal interpretation of Genesis, what do you do with Genesis 4, verses 15 to 17? Then the Lord said to him, Cain, to Adam, about slaying Cain, not so. If anyone slays Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who came upon him should kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and dwelt on the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Now, where the hell did his wife come from? Where are all these people who are going to threaten him Where are they? I mean, we had Adam and Eve, and suddenly we have all these people around who are going to.
Well, don't you think that the Bible's full of contradictions? You can probably prove or disprove almost anything
No,
you want.
the
If you take it
Genesis,
literally.
Genesis is allegorical. It was written allegorically, and yet we have
Literal
at
interpretation.
least 46% of Americans.
It
Well,
doesn't, I mean, it doesn't hold up to the most elemental principle of logic at all, because you start out with Adam and Eve,
Right.
right?
No, I think incidentally, to prove your point, John, and Dick, I think.
Did Adam and Eve have any daughters?
No, they just had.
And how
two-
are you going to populate the species
Oh,
without?
Well, where
well.
did Cain find his wife?
Yeah.
But see, this is the thing. This kind,
Primates.
This kind of, what Kruse is pointing out is this kind of fundamentalism makes it easy for the corporations to use religion as a control device.
Yeah.
Because you would expect somebody would look at the section I just read and said, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about, literal? Yet, 46% of Americans do not believe that evolution occurred.
Right.
20% of them believe that it never occurred at all. 26% believe it might have occurred but never involved humans. Now, if you got this kind of incredible ignorance going around, then you can really
Play on it.
control.
And
play
what's
on that.
interesting about this is that years ago, some social scientists actually looked at the connection between religion and economic development. And they found, with the exception of the United States, there's almost a direct correlation between religious fanaticism and the lack of economic development.
Absolutely.
And the United States screws up the whole thing because based on the religious fanaticism in this country, our economic level should be at the level of Bangladesh, is where it
Except
should
for
be.
natural resources.
Yeah.
Let me give you a statistic that I found in the book very interesting. To your point, John, on literal interpretation of the Bible, just like church attendance rose dramatically during the period when this was, when Reagan came to office, 81% of the people said that they interpreted the Bible as literally the Word of God. 81% of the people. That was at its peak. That's what Kruse says. Now,
And how did Reagan get off being portrayed as this great religious man?
A guy who never went to church?
How did that happen?
now
He started going to church when he became governor of California, literally.
And to your point, I'd like to raise another point I think that Kruse triggered in my mind. You're right. The countries that have religious fanaticism do not have good economic growth. Capitalists like to attribute that to the magic of the free market. But the reality is, in addition to the wealth of natural resources in this continent, in effect, we may today be facing the kind of thing you're talking about, because we no longer have that inordinate relative wealth of natural resource. And there's a wonderful book that I brought again because I think it's just so important to understanding the economic part of what we're talking about. And that's James K. Galbraith's book, The End of Normal, The Future of Growth in a Capitalist System. And he points out that there will be continued increase in economic inequality, continued increase in finding all kinds of ways, including religion, to support deregulation and instant gratification of profit, because it's the only way we can create an artificial growth in the new paradigm, non-growth paradigm that we're really into in our form of capitalism. We don't any longer have that natural growth, and we're creating it by deregulation, by getting rid of Glass-Steagall, by doing all of those things. And And how do we convince people that it's in their interest for us to do that? Religion is one of the ways we convince them.
It is one of the ways, yeah.
It's a major way. It's a distraction.
Yeah.
That's right.
So even though everything that you're saying is true, it's also true that Eisenhower really wasn't involved in any of that kind of thing at all.
No,
And
he
in
wasn't.
fact, I want to read this paragraph where he talks about what Ike did with regard to the economy. Here's what he says. Even though Ike's rise to power had depended on support from Texas oil millionaires such as Sid Richardson, he refused to roll back the welfare state they despised. In fundamental ways, he ensured the longevity of the New Deal, giving a bipartisan stamp of approval to its continuation and significantly expanding its reach. Notably, Ike pushed Congress to extend Social Security coverage to another 10 million Americans and expand benefits as well. In his first term, the president repeatedly resisted calls from conservatives to cut education spending. In his second, he secured an additional $1 billion for the cause. On a much larger scale, Ike established the single largest public works project in American history with the interstate highway system, a massive undertaking whose cost soon exceeded the original estimate of $101 billion. As government spending increased, meanwhile, the president did little to bring down tax rates for the wealthy. The top bracket barely dipped, declining from 94% to 92% over the course of his 2 terms in office. Barry Goldwater, among others, in retrospect, considered Ike's administration just a dime store New Deal.
That's right, and he managed to put together religion with a positive view of the role of government, but that didn't last after him, because after Eisenhower, we had Nixon. Later we had Nixon, and Nixon, and of course, ultimately under Reagan, we had religion being the anti-government, the individualism that crept in, and therefore we had not only a support of free enterprise capitalism, but a real anti-government, government being the problem, not the solution.
Well, here's this one other quote I want to mention, because he's talking at this point about what happens after the Eisenhower era and how the whole thing kind of comes apart.
Yep.
And this is what he says. He says, as the country became more polarized over the course of the ensuing decades, the slogans of the Eisenhower era could no longer hold them together. More than that, the religious rhetoric itself often became a source of division, especially at the local level, as seen in the struggles over school prayer. And he devotes an entire chapter over that. The Nixon White House had hoped to repeat the earlier work of the Eisenhower years, in many cases tapping the same political and religious figures for leadership positions, the same conservative philanthropists and corporations for funding, the same patriotic and fraternal organizations for grassroots support, and even some of the same sympathetic entertainers as his public face. But the political climate had been thoroughly transformed. The rhetoric of one nation under God no longer brought Americans together. It only reminded them how divided they had become.
And there's another device that it's not so much the corporate leaders, but the conservatives, the fundamentalists, are using, and that is they're constantly, people like Mike Huckabee and people of that stripe, they're constantly attributing to the Founding Fathers a belief in Christianity. In fact, most of the Founding Fathers were not.
That's right.
They were either deists or agnostics.
Yeah.
But there's something even deeper in what they've done. There's another new book. This is just came out by Amy Kittelstrom. She's a history professor, and it's titled The Religion of Democracy, 7 Liberals and the American Moral Tradition. And she looks at John Adams and Mary Emerson, William Channing, William James, Thomas Davidson, and Jane Addams. And what she points out in the book, which reliable American historians, including Kevin Kruse, are familiar with, and that is that the religion that the Founding Fathers practiced, and she does see John Adams as a religious person, was what the fundamentalists now would call a secular religion. It was a religion very much involved with the use of reason, the use of mind.
Yeah.
That it is an intellectual exercise. And the fundamentalists have succeeded remarkably well in erasing that historical remembrance, that they were not of this literal interpretation of the Bible or anything of that kind. She says the long cultural and intellectual lineage represented by these thinkers stretches back to classical liberalism, the political commitment of a society to replace coercion with consent. Their genealogy extends forward all the way to modern liberalism, the moral commitment of a society to the collective needs of all of its members, regardless of their differences. Between the ideal of modern liberalism that has never been realized and the theory of classical liberalism that has never been dismantled, these liberals and the rest of their intellectual family tree helped Americans and others to think about why human beings ought to treat one another as equals who deserve to be free. Now, these are rational thoughts. These are what the Founding Fathers, as we all know, had. And it's amazing from those first meetings in 1933 right through, as you say, the Nixon administration and into the present. Reagan was very much involved in this. George W. Bush. Remember George W. Bush's asinine comment, who's your favorite political philosopher, Jesus? Just ridiculous. Yeah. But they've been able to, again, as you just said, push away, bury this tradition of intellectualism.
We've talked a lot about how close the two political parties are, how few differences there are. But this is one of the areas in which there is a difference, a significant difference, because virtually all of the Democrats who are even thinking of running for president support the idea of evolution, and literally none of the Republicans support it. Now, what I have here is this article where it runs through, with regard to evolution, what the positions are of all these different Republicans. And interesting, Jeb Bush was asked, do you believe in evolution? He says, yes, I do, but it shouldn't be taught in schools. That's what he says.
Did he really?
And Christie typically says it's none of your business. Ted Kruse, while his kooky father would like you to know that evolution is a communist lie, the Texas senator said, I won't discuss evolution directly, he says. And it just goes down through all of them, and none of them...
Let me just add this little thing on Ted Kruse.
Yeah.
In terms of global climate change, he said, quote, very recently, quote, I equate climate changes with the flat earthers.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. As he did say that.
This is Princeton Harvard degree speaking.
The thing is, there's not one of these Republicans who's running for president who is willing to endorse the idea of evolution. In some cases, they refuse to talk about it. In other cases, they say, no, it's no good. Right. But none of them are willing to endorse it. And this is one of the few examples where you can find a real distinction between Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have to give them that. I wish, though, you see, that says a lot to me in two ways. Number one, it is true that is a difference, but it's not one that interferes particularly with the corporate agenda. When it comes to executing the corporate agenda, then I think the differences begin to diminish. And the best example of that is the polls that show what the public opinion is on many issues versus the way our legislators are voting in Congress.
But I think it can actually have a difference in Congress, particularly with regard to global warming. If the Republicans control Congress, and none of them believe in global warming,
that's true.
Then we're not going to be able to do anything. And we're headed for the precipice. This is where we're headed.
That's right.
If we don't do something about this, we're not going to be around to talk about it, or our grandkids are not going to be around to talk about it.
That's right.
So I think it's very significant.
And one of the ways they're countering it, the Republicans is by the use of the religious extremists, the fundamentalists.
That's right.
There's a quote from, first of all, this morning on NPR, I was tremendously impressed. Again, tying this to the economic policies of our country. Israel, Mexico, and the United States are the three industrialized nations with the highest economic inequality. The United States being number one.
Yeah.
And more importantly, according to NPR this morning, the United States, the inequality is increasing at a faster rate in the United States than any other country in the world. And Galbraith points out that that's going to continue because it needs to in order to get the immediate profit, disregarding the creation of aggregate demand in the long term. So that's a big issue. That's a big issue in terms of how our economy functions. And yet, we're using, again, religion, and as he points out here, in some of the quotes of these evangelical ministers and heads of various churches, particularly the one on the Southern Baptist leader, who talk about the value of wealth and how God has promised wealth, and that we should be more concerned with capital gain, in effect, than they convert that to say we should be more concerned with capital gain than the common good.
There's another way that Kruse says that this is being done, what you're describing, which is, again, as he points out, and others point out, a misreading of the New Testament. The way that these religious conservatives that he talks about are using the New Testament is to say that the income inequality is the individual's fault.
That's right, yeah.
And there's a constant use of religion to say that God has given you everything. If you don't have it, it's your fault. And that plays into this narrative very well.
Okay, well, I came across this piece originally on CNN, looking for the date here. It's actually a poll that was done by Pew just last October, and about how Americans feel about the intersection between religions and politics. This, I don't know, I'd be interested in how you react to it, but I found it quite surprising to me. Nearly a third of Americans say they want houses of worship to back particular candidates. Despite IRS rules that prohibit churches from doing so, they want it to remain tax exempt. That's an increase of 8 percentage points since 2010. An even higher percentage, nearly half of all Americans, said churches and other religious institutions should openly express their views on social and political issues, an increase of 6% since 2010. The findings of the Pew study contradict what seemed to be a trend toward increased secularization in American social and political life, surprising experts like Seth Dallin, an assistant professor of American religious history at Pacific Lutheran University in Washington State. And it just goes through more and more of these numbers, but it doesn't seem to be, when it comes to Americans generally, it doesn't seem to be that they have sort of any problem. And the question I want to raise to you all is, what about this whole concept of the separation of church and state? It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of support for that among Americans.
And I think, well, let's talk about that, because I think that's critical. I think that those statistics represent, first of all, the growth of the fundamentalist and evangelical churches as opposed to the mainstream churches, because that's where much of that feeling is. It also represents the effect of the propaganda machine used by our politicians to use religion to that effect. You know, there's a quote from Reagan that I love in Kruse's book, when Reagan said, one nation under God one nation under God can become one nation gone under. He's playing with words, and he's saying, he's telling people the value of everything has to be church oriented. And I think that's you're seeing that in those statistics. You're seeing it in the statistics of the growth of the evangelical church. You look at the evangelical churches. I just drove through Georgia, Virginia, Carolinas, Alabama recently, and the number of, I enjoyed watching the number of billboards that you pass on the highway that are all touting these fundamentalist preachers who are preaching the gospel of wealth. One of them wants to buy a $65 million airplane, wants his parishioners to pay for it. They're one after another sending you the message that these guys are talking about. So it hasn't gone away. It's there.
Okay, so
there's another response to your question, Dick.
Sure.
And Kruse doesn't talk about this, and I wish he did. And that is, we've already made pretty clear that what we're talking about in terms of Christianity in most of this country, most of the religions, is not the New Testament, something else. And what I'm seeing, and this poll I think reflects it, is that we're using Christianity as a tribal identification.
That's right.
That if you are part of our tribe, you need to be a Christian. It has nothing to do with ethics or New Testament or love your neighbors. You know, if you have two coats, give one to your. No, it's none of that. It's that if you are not, if you're not Christian, you're not one of us. Jews suffered through this in a lot of American history. Muslims are suffering through it right now in American history, as are agnostics and atheists. Mm-hmm. And so it is not, you know, I really believe in Christ. And so it's I'm a Christian. What are you? Which forms
and America,
this
therefore, is a Christian nation.
Right. I.e., it is a Christian.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Is the fact that this doesn't seem to sort of register that much in presidential politics the result of the fact that when we vote for a president, we're voting for an individual, for some sort of profile of an individual? Is that why it doesn't register there? So, for instance, all the religious animosity towards Obama, you know, did not bring him down. He first was able to get elected, and then he was able to get reelected rather handsomely. Is this because because presidential politics are a personality contest to a certain extent? How do we explain this? I mean, at the local level, at the congressional level, a lot of these religious people are having their way, but at the presidential level, they're not.
Well,
what's the
I'm
explanation?
not sure of that, because Kruse points out that even Obama, when he was running for office, used a lot of biblical reference.
Oh, yeah, he did.
And religion. Clinton started the idea of God bless America.
Sure.
You know, and was very religious in his.
But it didn't register in any of their policies, and
No,
Obama got
absolutely.
elected rather handsomely. So what's the explanation for this, John?
For me, the explanation of that 2008 victory is that in times of crisis, and we were in a time of great crisis then. We were economic crisis. Mm-hmm. We had this war that was a complete and utter disaster. That people at that point put aside most people, their various identifications, and voted for a guy they wouldn't normally vote for. And Obama had Republican votes. He had counties that normally vote Republican. He had a great deal of support because the crises triumphed over this religious identification.
And what about 212?
Well, there's an article in the most recent Harper's by David Bromwich, who, like me, was a great supporter of Obama in 2008, who says that Obama has literally done nothing. So with the election of a guy who was supposed to lead the country, and he had everything going for him. Yeah. He had a mandate, he had 2 houses of Congress, everything going for him. People have reverted back to what we've been talking about, to looking for religious certitude and safety and religion and so forth. We're back to that. It's a fallback position in the United States.
Okay, so
and by the way, and it's not in the other Western democracies.
I was just wanting to ask about the coming presidential election, 2016. We know that there's going to be a lot of religious input into the Republican primaries and all that, but the two of you have said that you think that a moderate Republican is going to actually get elected president. Do you think that the religious right is going to play a role in that?
Yes, I do.
A successful role in that?
Well, when you say successful, will they determine the election? Probably not. Will it be a base that is meaningful to the candidate, as it was for Reagan, as it was for Nixon, as it was for even Clinton? And I think the answer to that is yes.
I agree with Nate Silver and others that it is very unlikely for a Republican to gain the presidency in the near future. Very unlikely.
Oh, so you've changed your mind on that?
No, I've always said that.
Well, you said you thought a moderate Republican was.
No, that wasn't me.
Nominee. I think we said that.
Oh, nominee. Yes.
Nominee.
Nominee.
You,
No.
you said you thought he would take Massachusetts, is what you told me. On this show. On this show, you said that.
No. No.
Okay. All right.
What I said is that, and this relates to Kruse and others, while the Republicans, and I'm quoting various statisticians, will not gain the presidency in the near future, they will continue to control
State houses.
the state houses and the Congress. And one of the big factors that is enabling them is their emphasis on religion, the point that Kruse is making. They use that, they truck that out all the time. You look at a state like Kansas, which is in economic decline, it's suffering. What are they talking about? Abortion and gay marriage.
And
so
that
it becomes it's a distraction.
You combine that religious tone with the economic message that they have to have of deregulation and economic inequality, and you'll have a Republican mandate of policy in states and in Congress, whether you have a Republican president or not. I think that so that my feeling is that in the current election you'll see a lot more of the religious fervor, even though we're becoming presumably a more secular country. But the part that is attending church is evangelical and fundamentalist.
Yeah, yeah.
There's another factor that's going to play into that. The government forces, as well as the corporate world, is now also using ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of that, and they're giving it a religious tone. Now,
we saw that in the last congressional elections.
Yes.
Yeah.
ISIS is that's a political issue.
Yeah.
And ISIS is a bunch of thugs and gangsters. There's nothing to do with it. But they're using it. There are over 2 billion Muslims in the world, and we are talking as if these few thousand ISIS
are all about.
So it's the same pattern of using. It's that tribalism. It's we them, we them.
And it's easy to conflate, I suggest, fear with religion.
Yes.
And when you conflate fear with religion, then you have the best possible means of controlling the public mind. Incidentally, as a note of humor, I saw a sign that I thought was really interesting. It said, if you demand money and the threat of violence, you're arrested. But if you demand money with the promise of eternal damnation, it's tax exempt.
That's a good one. That's good.
Look,
that's good.
if we were really a, quote, Christian nation, i.e. a nation based on the New Testament, how would we tolerate the incredible suffering that the Palestinians are undergoing?
That's right.
Now? There's no way that a, quote, Christian nation would tolerate it. How would a Christian nation tolerate 14 million people living in poverty? How would a Christian nation tolerate 280,000, whatever the latest number is, homeless children, food insecure children?
Yeah, sure.
1 in 5.
That's why I say I don't.
Well, not to mention
believe it.
slavery. I mean, how do they get off with that? I mean, isn't Moses the guy that freed his people from slavery? And
Well, he wasn't a Christian.
Oh, wasn't a Christian. That's right.
Yeah, but they like to they like to go to the. There's a if these people want to get biblical, they should actually really read the Bible. I mean, there's another book we're recommending a lot of books today, but this book I think I mentioned last time. It's by Robert Putnam. It's called Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis.
Yeah.
And he refers to all this religiosity, and he asked then how come, I'll just quote from him, Proverbs 29:7 intones prophetically that the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. Mark 10:21-25 is about the rich man and the eye of the camel. Then Isaiah's angry God in Isaiah 3:15 thundered at Israel's elders and rulers, gathered to face his righteous wrath. How dare you crush my people, grinding the faces of the poor into the dust. So I'm not sure what the heck book they're reading.
Well, we have,
it's selective anyway.
Well, it's sort of like the Constitution. They're always talking about the Constitution. Yeah. Remember after 2010, when the new Congress came in and they were going to have this big celebration of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and they had to call it off because somebody actually read it.
That's right. Well, the truth of the matter is, of course, I show my anti-Christian bias, but I think that we have in all religions contrived it to be whatever suits the purpose, as you point out, just like we do the Constitution. Yeah. Whatever suits our purpose of the time, we contrive religion to be that. But God's word is what we want it to be. Remember, George Bush said that he spoke to God while he was shaving.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
And
by the way, you're not anti-Christian. You are anti this
that's right.
narrative. You're anti-Christian tribalism, right?
I'm anti what has happened to Christianity.
Well, it was
and the way it's
it also
used
reminds
in
me of the line from Lily Tomlin, the comedian, who once said, "When you talk to God, it's praying. When God talks to you, it's schizophrenia."
That's right. That's right.
There's before we come to an end, there's another element related to this that's happening in this country that we need to bring up, and it's especially been effective among the Tea Party, and that's what's called either Christian Reconstructionism or Dominionism, and was led by
Dominionism, very important.
Yes, led by a fellow who's died recently, Rusa Rushduni. And others have picked up on this. They just absolutely negate the idea of separation of church and state. You are either believe in Christianity or you're not an American. And they also, because of the way they look at things, there is no way. Inhofe, Senator Inhofe is a type. There is no way that there's going to be climate change because God's in charge and God does not.
Well, not only that.
That's sort of very close to what Clinton said about Bush 1. When Bush 1 was making all these accusations about Clinton being unchristian and stuff like that, and what Clinton gave the statement where he said, he seems to be telling us that if we don't endorse the Republican platform, then not only are we not a Christian, we're not an American.
That's right. Well, that's right. And of course, that's where the environmentalist thing comes in too, because the dominionists, of course, quote the Bible as saying that we have dominion over the earth, and we should, Rush Limbaugh said.
That's their key verse.
We've talked about all the sort of negative aspects of religion. I want to talk just very briefly about the positive aspects of it, because I think religion has sort of two towers to it in this country, and there is a long tradition of really good work among church people. The Civil Rights Movement is certainly a really, really good example of that. The anti-slavery movement was another one. It was interesting that during the Vietnam War protests and all of that, which I was intimately involved in, and it was overwhelmingly Catholic. There was very little in the way of Protestant involvement in that. It was actually what they called the Catholic left. They actually used to call it that, the Catholic left. But then in the 1980s, you had this spread among Presbyterians in the Southwest with the sanctuary movement, and you had the third world solidarity movements where people from churches were going down to El Salvador to stay with people who they thought would be the victim of the death squad. They figured if Americans were with them, they wouldn't get killed, and it was this huge spread, So this is like the other side of it,
Look at the nuns who were killed down there.
Well, I think you're making a very excellent point. And what I think you've done, Dick, is to importantly distinguish people of faith, people who practice religion, from organized religion.
Yeah.
And again, as Reza Aslan points out, this is what the New Testament is about. It's not about Virgin Mary, Mother of God, cardinals, bishops, sacraments, and it's about none of that. It is about what you were just talking about. Okay. It's about people who actually are out there trying very hard to practice their faith. Right. The same kind of people who are working with the poor fit into that. And that includes a lot of nuns. And
that's the way the Christian church ought to be about. Incidentally, before we leave it, one positive note also, I think, is I just listened to an hour and a half of Chris Hedges, and I have to say that his book, Wages of Rebellion, I have not read yet because I just got it today, and I don't like to recommend books I haven't read, but I listened to him talk about it for an hour and a half. Mm-hmm. And he's saying that if we believe what needs to be done in this country, then we'd better develop meaningful grassroots movements. And
he's in a particular position to talk about this, like John is. He was a seminary student as well.
He graduated from seminary. He was ordained minister, Presbyterian Church.
Yeah,
that's what I mean by people of faith that you were talking about.
I understand. So do we want to say something about the Pope before we leave, who seems to be a breath of fresh air?
He is a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, he is.
He recently said that those who deny climate change are going to have to explain themselves to God. He said that.
I mean, this is a whole series of things.
The other thing he did is he recognized Palestine, the state of Palestine.
Well, he was also recognized the Armenian genocide.
Well, yes, he also made 2 Palestinian saints.
He did.
And I would also say to you that I thought about that when I was reading Kruse's book. The Pope would have a very hard time with Fifield or Billy Graham.
Yes.
Or some of the Catholic equivalents too that we've had.
Okay, we're coming to the end here. I just want to read. This is actually virtually the last paragraph in the book, which I thought kind of sums it all up. Here's what he says. This history reminds us that our public religion is in large measure an invention of the modern era. Their ceremonies and symbols that breathe life into the belief that we are one nation under God were not, as many Americans believe, created alongside the nation itself. Their parentage stems not from the founding fathers, but from an era much closer to our own, the era of our own fathers and mothers, our grandfathers and grandmothers. This fact need not diminish their importance. Fresh traditions can be powerful than older ones adhered to out of habit. Nevertheless, we do violence to our past if we treat certain phrases, one nation under God, in God we trust, as sacred text handed down to us from the nation's founding. Instead, we are better served if we understand these utterances for what they are, political slogans that speak not to the origins of our nation, but to a specific point in its not-so-distant past. If they are to mean anything to us now, we should understand what they meant then.
Good.
And that will do it for today. I want to thank you both for being here. And until next time, do whatever you can for peace and social justice. Thank you very much.
But when the system fails, it's up to us to speak our piece. We must be ever vigilant for justice to prevail. So get courage from your convictions. Let them haul you off to jail. Have you been to jail for justice? Want to shake your hand? 'Cause sitting in and lying down are ways to take a stand. Have you sung a song for freedom or marched that picket line?